War movies often promise heroism, sacrifice, and clean moral lines, but some films refuse that comfort. They drag the camera into basements, camps, and shattered minds where humanity collapses under pressure. These stories were not just controversial, they were considered dangerous. So disturbing that even Germany, with its commitment to remembrance, once said no. What follows are films that cross that line. Number 9. Rome Open City, 1945. Roberto Rossellini's Rome Open City does not announce itself as extreme. There are no grand battle scenes, no cinematic spectacle. That is exactly why it terrified censors. Shot in the ruins of Nazi-occupied Rome just months after liberation, the film feels less like fiction and more like a wound still bleeding. Its power comes from how casually it depicts cruelty as routine. Violence arrives suddenly without warning or flourish and leaves no room for emotional escape. The film follows ordinary civilians, priests, resistance members, and families as they live under constant surveillance, betrayal, and fear. Arrests happen in daylight. Interrogations occur behind thin walls. The occupying forces are not monsters or caricatures. They are bureaucratic, efficient, and chillingly calm. That realism was deeply uncomfortable in post-war Germany, where early reconstruction focused on distance from lived guilt rather than confrontation with it. What made the film especially controversial was its refusal to sanitize suffering. Executions are abrupt and humiliating. Pain is not poetic. Death is not meaningful. Each the most shocking moments are quiet ones where the camera refuses to turn away and allows the audience to sit with the consequence. For German authorities in the early years, this was considered destabilizing. The fear was not outrage, but recognition. Rome Open City was restricted, delayed, and treated cautiously, not because it exaggerated history, but because it stripped away the protective layer of myth. It showed occupation as it actually felt: confusing, degrading, and relentlessly cruel. In doing so, it forced viewers to reckon with complicity and silence rather than battlefield heroics. Today, the film is considered foundational to modern cinema, but its initial reception proves how threatening honesty can be. It did not shout accusations. It simply showed what happened, and for many that was far more disturbing than any spectacle. Number 8. The Pawnbroker, 1964. Sidney Lumet's. The Pawnbroker is not set in wartime Europe. It takes place in post-war America inside the mind of a survivor who never truly left the camps. That psychological approach is precisely what made it so controversial. Instead of depicting history at a distance, the film presents trauma as something ongoing, invasive, and impossible to escape. Rod Steiger plays a man emotionally sealed off from the world. He runs a pawn shop surrounded by poverty, noise, and desperation, yet feels nothing. Or rather, he feels too much. The film fractures time using sudden, intrusive memories that erupt without warning. These moments do not explain themselves. They overwhelm. The viewer experiences confusion, disorientation, and emotional paralysis, mirroring the character's inner state. Yet as German authorities were deeply uneasy with this approach when the film circulated internationally. It did not frame survival as triumph. It presented aftermath as damage. Worse, it suggested that polite post-war normalcy did not erase responsibility or memory. The film includes brief but devastating glimpses of camp life not staged for shock, but presented as psychic scars. The Pawnbroker was also controversial for how it linked historical atrocity to modern indifference. The suffering did not stay in the past. It bled into daily life relationships and moral numbness. That implication challenged the idea that history could be neatly compartmentalized. For a country still navigating public memory, the film was seen as emotionally destabilizing. It did not allow audiences to observe from a safe moral distance. It implicated them through empathy. Today, it is considered one of the most important films about trauma ever made. At the time, its psychological honesty made it dangerous. Number 7. Kapò, 1960. Gillo Pontecorvo's Kapò remains one of the most divisive films ever made about the camps. Unlike later restrained portrayals, this film confronts viewers with sustained brutality, moral compromise, and the slow erosion of identity. It was banned and restricted in multiple territories, including Germany, because of its unflinching approach and ethical ambiguity. The film follows a young woman who survives by becoming part of the camp hierarchy. Her choices are not framed as heroic or villainous. They are shown as desperate adaptations to an inhuman system. Guards beat prisoners. Death is omnipresent. Survival itself becomes morally corrosive. That was deeply unsettling to audiences accustomed to clearer narratives of innocence and guilt. German authorities objected not only to the imagery, but to the implication that systems create monsters more efficiently than individuals do. The film does not isolate cruelty to a few villains. It shows how structure, routine, and fear dismantle morality piece by piece. Kapò was accused of being too raw, too close, too unresolved. It offered no catharsis, no redemption arc that restored order. Instead, it left audiences sitting with discomfort and contradiction. That unresolved tension made it unacceptable for public circulation in a society still defining how to remember. Decades later, Kapò is studied precisely because of what made it controversial. It refuses to protect the viewer. It asks whether survival itself can be a kind of trauma, and it leaves the answer painfully open. Number 6. The Tin Drum, 1979. The Tin Drum is one of the most unsettling films ever produced in Germany because it turns the rise of Nazism into something grotesque, intimate, and deeply uncomfortable. Rather than focusing on soldiers or battlefields, the film traps the viewer inside a warped, childlike perspective where violence, ideology, and cruelty seep into everyday life without resistance. That approach made it explosive, not because it invented horrors, but because it reflected them back through the lens of complicity. The story follows Oscar, a boy who refuses to grow physically while the world around him descends into chaos. His refusal becomes symbolic. Adults choose not to mature morally, and society chooses not to intervene. Oscar watches Rally's beatings and public cruelty unfold as if they are performances. His drum becomes both protest and surrender. Noise replaces action. Observation replaces responsibility. German authorities and cultural institutions struggled with the film because it shattered the preferred narrative of separation. The problem was not them, it was us. The film suggests that fascism thrived not only through force, but through silence, distraction, and indulgence. Ordinary citizens are shown laughing, dancing, and adapting as brutality becomes routine. That portrayal was considered corrosive to national self-understanding. The imagery is deliberately grotesque. Faces distort. Crowds lose individuality. Celebrations turn sinister. There is no respectful distance from history here. The past feels invasive. Claustrophobic. The film does not ask for sympathy. It asks for recognition, and that recognition was deeply unwelcome. For years, the Tin Drum faced bans, restrictions, and public backlash even within Germany, despite winning international awards. The discomfort came from its refusal to present Nazism as an external infection. It shows it as something that grew inside familiar spaces, kitchens, schools, and festivals. Today, the film is recognized as a landmark of German cinema precisely because it refused reassurance. It does not explain how things went wrong. It shows how easily they did, and that remains a dangerous message. Number 5. The Night Porter, 1974. The Night Porter is one of the most controversial films ever associated with WWII because it explores memory, guilt, and power without moral guardrail. That years after the war, the film follows a former camp officer and a former prisoner who encounter each other in a Viennese hotel. What unfolds is not a story of justice or reconciliation. It is a psychological standoff built on unresolved trauma and domination. German authorities reacted with immediate alarm. The film refused to present clear moral roles. It did not offer punishment or redemption. Instead, it examined how violent systems leave psychological bonds that do not dissolve when uniforms disappear. That implication was considered dangerous. It suggested that the war did not end cleanly in 1945. The film's power lies in its suffocating atmosphere. Memory intrudes constantly. Flashbacks do not explain themselves. They trap the viewer inside emotional loops where fear, dependency, and control blur together. The relationship at the center of the film is not romanticized. It is shown as corrosive, isolating, and destructive. Yet it is also shown as real. That honesty was what caused outrage. In Germany, the concern was not sensationalism, but destabilization. The film challenged the idea that victims and perpetrators could always be separated neatly by time or circumstance. It implied that trauma could distort identity long after liberation. That suggestion collided with efforts to frame the past as resolved. The Night Porter was restricted, delayed, and publicly condemned for years. Critics argued over whether it crossed ethical boundaries, but the film itself refuses to debate. It presents its characters as trapped by memory, unable to escape roles written by history. Decades later, it remains profoundly uncomfortable. Not because of what it shows, but because of what it refuses to explain away. It asks whether memory can imprison people more effectively than walls ever did, and that question remains deeply unsettling. Number 4. Salò, or the 120 Days of Sodom, 1975. Salò is not a conventional war film. It contains no battles, no heroics, and no narrative relief. Yet it may be the most disturbing portrayal of fascism ever put on screen. Set in the final days of Mussolini's regime, the film depicts absolute power exercised without consequence inside a sealed environment where cruelty becomes ritual. Germany banned and restricted the film for decades because it crossed from representation into accusation. The violence in Salò is not explosive. It is procedural, calm, systematic. That is what made it unbearable. The film argues that fascism is not chaos. It is order stripped of conscience. The perpetrators are educated, refined, and detached. They justify everything through rules and hierarchy. Victims are reduced to objects managed and discarded. The film offers no emotional release. The camera observes with cold precision, refusing to guide the viewer toward comfort or outrage. That neutrality was interpreted as dangerous. German authorities viewed the film as corrosive to public morality and collective memory. It did not frame fascism as historical aberration. It framed it as a logical outcome of unchecked authority and obedience. That implication reached beyond Italy. It implicated any society willing to trade humanity for structure. Salò was not banned because it was confusing. It was banned because it was clear. Clear about how power functions, clear about how institutions enable cruelty, clear about how language, law, and ceremony can normalize the unthinkable. Even today, the film remains restricted in many places, not because time has softened it, but because its message has not aged. It does not ask what happened. It asks why it was allowed to happen, and that question still makes people uncomfortable. Number 3. Men Behind the Sun, 1988. Men Behind the Sun is one of the most harrowing WWII films ever made because it abandons metaphor entirely. It presents atrocity as procedure, experimentation carried out with clinical detachment. The film focuses on the activities of a Japanese wartime research unit and depicts cruelty not as rage, but as routine labor performed by educated professionals following orders. Germany restricted and condemned the film because of its uncompromising realism. The violence is not stylized. It is instructional. The camera does not flinch or distract. Viewers are forced to confront how ordinary people participated in extraordinary cruelty when shielded by authority and ideology. That theme resonated uncomfortably with Germany's own historical reckoning. What makes the film uniquely disturbing is its emphasis on method. Suffering is inflicted step by step. Notes are taken. Results are observed. There is no villainous spectacle, just institutional calm. This depiction strips away the excuse of madness and replaces it with obedience. That implication was deeply unsettling for audiences and regulators alike. The film was accused of being exploitative, yet defenders argued its refusal to soften reality was precisely the point. It denies the audience emotional distance. There is no heroic intervention, no moment of moral correction. Cruelty is allowed to continue until the system itself collapses. German authorities viewed the film as potentially destabilizing because it framed atrocity as something enabled by structure rather than individual evil. It suggested that modern educated societies are fully capable of mechanized cruelty when insulated by bureaucracy. Men Behind the Sun remains controversial not because it exaggerates history, but because it refuses symbolism. It treats atrocity as administrative, and by doing so it asks an uncomfortable question. If cruelty can become routine, once it can become routine again. Number 2. The Gray Zone, 2001. The Gray Zone is one of the most morally destabilizing films ever made about the camps because it rejects every familiar narrative frame. There are no clear heroes, no redemptive arcs, no moral victories. Instead, the film explores survival within an impossible system where every choice carries consequence and guilt is unavoidable. The film focuses on prisoners forced to assist in the machinery of destruction. Their actions are not portrayed as betrayal nor absolution. They are depicted as coerced survival under threat of immediate death. This moral ambiguity is the core of the film and the reason it was restricted and controversial in Germany. German authorities and cultural institutions reacted cautiously because the film challenged binary thinking. It refused to divide history into pure victims and pure villains. Instead, it examined how systems of terror fracture morality itself. That approach risked misinterpretation in public discourse, still sensitive to questions of responsibility. The film's tone is suffocating. Dialogue is sparse. The environment feels sealed and airless. Violence is implied through reaction and aftermath rather than spectacle, yet the cumulative effect is overwhelming. The viewer is trapped alongside the characters, forced to witness their calculations, fear, and despair. What unsettled regulators was not graphic imagery, but ethical proximity. The film places the audience inside moral paralysis. It asks what choice means when none are free. That question disrupts the comfort of hindsight. The Gray Zone insists that understanding history requires confronting its most uncomfortable truths, that survival did not always look noble, that resistance was not always possible, that judgment from safety can distort reality. For Germany, still navigating how to teach remembrance, the film's refusal to simplify made it deeply challenging. Today, it is recognized as one of the most honest examinations of coercion ever put on screen. Its power lies not in accusation, but in proximity. It does not explain. It exposes. Number 1. Come and See, 1985. Come and See is widely considered one of the most devastating war films ever made because it dismantles the idea of war cinema itself. There is no strategy, no honor, no narrative control. The film follows a young boy as his world collapses under occupation and the camera traps the viewer inside his psychological disintegration. Germany restricted the film for years because of its relentless realism. The violence is not choreographed. It erupts suddenly and lingers in silence. The film does not guide emotion. It overwhelms it. Sound distorts. Faces hollow. Time stretches and fractures. The audience experiences war not as spectacle but as sensory assault. What makes makes Come and See uniquely disturbing is its refusal to offer distance. The camera stays close, often too close. The viewer becomes witness, not observer. Scenes unfold without commentary, forcing the audience to process horror without narrative relief. German authorities feared the film's intensity could traumatize viewers. More importantly, it dismantled sanitized portrayals of Eastern Front history that had circulated for decades. The film depicts civilian destruction with brutal clarity, showing how ideology translated into annihilation at the village level. There are no villains delivering speeches. There is no triumph at the end. Only exhaustion damage and irreversible loss. The boy does not learn a lesson. He ages internally beyond recovery. That psychological realism was considered destabilizing rather than educational. Come and See does not explain war. It recreates its effect. That is why it was considered too much. Too real. Too honest. It forces viewers to feel what history textbooks often soften. Decades later, the film remains almost unbearable to watch. Not because of excess, but because of precision. It shows what happens when humanity collapses completely, and it never lets the viewer forget it. These films were not banned for shock alone. They were feared because they dismantled comfort. They refused heroes, refused closure, and refused distance. Each one forces history back into the present and asks a question many would rather avoid. What happens when remembrance stops being safe and starts being honest?